The calendar marked April 18, 1942. The spring sun had already risen over the Japanese archipelago, an ordinary day, filled with the familiar sound of temple bells and the ceaseless activity of factories. For months, since the triumph of Pearl Harbor, the heart of the empire had bathed in the aura of an almost mythical invulnerability. War, for most ordinary citizens, was a distant success fought on remote seas, guaranteed by the insurmountable wall of the vast ocean. Japan was the impenetrable citadel, the sacred base of glory. It was a faith more than a military strategy. In that moment of certainty, on the morning that should have been just another of guaranteed peace, that faith was shattered by a sound no one expected to hear. That sound was not the roar of imperial fighters on patrol. It was a deeper rumble, a dissonant engine noise that erupted over Tokyo and, almost simultaneously, over the major cities surrounding it. They were 16B-25 Mitchell bombers, heavy aircraft, unsuitable for carrier takeoffs. And yet, there they were. They flew low, skimming the rooftops, their shadows gliding over residential areas and industrial blocks. Within minutes, the unassailable reality of the empire, a pillar of the national psyche, disintegrated under the weight of conventional bombs, incendiaries, and, above all, psychological terror. It was not an attack of annihilation. It was a punch to the nation's soul. The operation, led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, seemed at first glance like a gesture of pure, suicidal audacity, a desperate response from the United States, still reeling from the blows in the Pacific. Its tactical value was limited. The bombs caused modest damage compared to the vastness of Japanese industry. But the intent was never large-scale material destruction. The mission was purely psychological, to break the myth of invulnerability, to force the Imperial Command to divert precious resources from the front line to internal defense, and, crucially, to restore the shaken morale of a distant enemy. A handful of bombers, on a clear day, achieved something that months of naval warfare had yet to accomplish, planting the seed of doubt and fear in the very center of power. That beginning of 1942 was the darkest period for the Allied war effort. The tide of defeats in the Pacific was relentless. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, the Malay Peninsula, and Singapore fell successively. The overwhelming Japanese carrier fleet seemed invincible, and the American capital, Washington, felt the weight of a population demanding revenge, but receiving only news of retreat. President Franklin Roosevelt needed an act, not a long-term plan. He needed a spark to ignite hope and, more importantly, to remind the Japanese leader that war was a two-way street. The Doolittle raid was born from this visceral necessity, a balance between military strategy and the maintenance of public faith. The audacity of the idea lay in challenging aeronautical engineering itself. B-25 Mitchell bombers, the Army's twin-engine medium-range aircraft, had never launched from a Navy aircraft carrier. A ship's runway is short, unstable, and the B-25s were designed for long land-based strips. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, a legendary aviator and talented engineer, supervised the painstaking modifications, the removal of everything superfluous, heavy radios, tail armament, even the paint layer, all to save the weight needed to maximize fuel. Range was the obsession. The margin of error was zero. The mission, from the outset, carried the premonition of sacrifice. The removal of heavy defensive weapons, such as the tail machine guns, replaced by black-painted wooden pipes to simulate cannons, was a peak of the risk strategy. Faith in total surprise was worth more than defensive firepower. During secret training in Florida, the 80 young airmen, all volunteers who did not know their target, practiced takeoffs on ground strips simulating the restricted length of the flight deck. The risk was palpable. If an engine failed in the first few feet, the plane and its crew would be thrown into the sea. Courage was measured not by the absence of fear, but by the acceptance of the probability of disaster in the name of fulfillment. War is often made of cruel calculations where individual life becomes a disposable variable in a larger equation of morality and politics. The task force departed for the Pacific in silence. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet and its support group navigated treacherous waters, relying on fog and luck to approach Japan. The original plan called for the B-25s to launch about 400 miles from the coast, an extreme limit of autonomy. But destiny in war is invariably imposed. On that morning of April 18th, about 650 nautical miles from Japan, 250 more than the ideal, the horizon revealed the unwelcome sight. It was a Japanese Sentinel patrol boat, the Nito Maru, tasked with alerting the command in Tokyo to any enemy approach. Although the patrol craft was quickly sunk by an American destroyer, it had time to transmit an incomplete warning, a nervous message about enemy ships. The element of surprise had been lost. Admiral William Halsey and Colonel Doolittle faced a brutal dilemma. Should they abort, saving the fleet and the bombers, but sacrificing the main objective? Or should they launch immediately, under the risk of massive interception, knowing that no plane would have the fuel to reach safety in China? Doolittle, with the weight of 80 lives on his conscience, made the decision that history awaited. Launch. Doolittle's choice was a turning point. He knew that failure to attack Tokyo, after all the logistical risk, would result in a moral defeat that would nullify any tactical success. The strategic objective of morale outweighed the tactical safety of the crew. The air grew heavy on the Hornet's deck. The weather was rough, the sea choppy, and salt water sprayed across the deck. Doolittle was the first to take off. The scene was almost surreal. A heavy bomber, designed for land, racing across the wet deck, swaying dangerously as the wind lashed the ship. Everyone held their breath. Doolittle's aircraft gained speed and, for an instant that seemed infinite, hovered over the water before taking to the skies. One after another, under the tension and silent prayer of their comrades, all 16 planes achieved the feat. It was a miracle of engineering, courage, and despair. The attack on Japan was no longer a plan. It was an inevitable reality. The turning point of the mission and the core of its moral analysis is not when the bombs fell, but in those initial seconds on the deck. There, Doolittle embodied the choice between the safety of the men and the political imperative. His decision meant sacrificing equipment and accepting the probability of terrible casualties, but ensured the psychological success. When loyalty to a greater purpose becomes a prison, what remains of freedom? What remains is the awareness that some actions, however costly to the individual, can be the inflection point for the destiny of a collective. The audacity of the action, however, does not hide the ethical dilemma inherent in all military strategy, the transformation of suffering into propaganda. The Doolittle raid did exactly that. The explosions in Tokyo and Yokohama did not paralyze Japanese production. They paralyzed a narrative of invincibility that sustained national morale. The mission was a symbolic assault, a demonstration of strength based on breaking a promise. The promise of the Imperial command that Japan was safe. What was at stake there was not the logistics of war, but its intangible essence, the will to fight. The B-25's entry into Japanese airspace was a triple shock. For the military command, which did not imagine that land-based bombers could be launched from aircraft carriers. For the anti-aircraft defense, which was poorly distributed and expecting an attack closer to the coast or even a night attack. And for the population, who saw the war for the first time, not in newspaper photos, but in the shadow of wings over their heads. The lack of reaction from Japanese defenses was, ironically, what allowed the bombers to fly low, delivering their payloads with surprising accuracy for time, hitting shipyards, factories, and fuel tanks. The direct material damage, estimated at a few tens of millions of dollars, little for a global war effort, was irrelevant compared to the damage to confidence. The perception that the defenders had failed to protect the emperor's home became a moral poison that spread to the entire command structure. The air that once smelled of sea salt and industrial pollution suddenly became heavy with the scent of ozone and explosives. When the planes left, leaving a trail of smoke and confusion, the Japanese leaders, especially Admiral Yamamoto, felt personally humiliated. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned about the possibility of American retaliation, and now that prophecy was fulfilled as audaciously as it was unexpectedly. For him, the attack confirmed that the only way to ensure Tokyo's safety was to annihilate what remained of the American carrier fleet in a decisive battle. Humiliation did not lead to prudence, but to escalation. The moral tension of the enemy, in war, is a powerful engine of risky decisions. Throughout the war, truth fragmented into diaries and short transmissions. Each record is an echo of conscience, a trace of a generation that lived the unspeakable with simple words. The surviving fragments reveal the invisible humanity of war: fear, doubt, faith, and eternal hope. In a scribbled note from a Tokyo civilian, found decades later in an old chest, the voice is low and tense. The neighbor's building was hit. The children came home from school early in silence. Before we shouted bonsai. Today, we whisper, will it last? The historian comments, it is a silence that follows shock. Patriotism, which was a collective shout, turns into an intimate, almost blasphemous question about the future and the protection of the state. Blind faith begins to give way to rational doubt, and the weight of distant defeats manifests suddenly in a creaking door in one's own home. The individual, who is merely a part of the empire's machinery, recovers in the terror of their own fragility. From a naval radio officer, stationed far from the capital, a transmission report spoke in code, but the fear was clear in its lines. We intercepted signals of fury and contradictory orders. The fleet demands clarification about a threat that, theoretically, could not exist. They seek an enemy in a place believed to be sacred territory, exempt from profanation. The historian analyzes. The confusion in command is the first and most important success of the mission. The attack did not damage ships. It damaged the coordination and credibility of leaders who had promised a war fought only on foreign territory. Invulnerability was not just a motto, it was a strategic foundation. When the elite begins to doubt, the foundation of the military structure begins to tremble. The feeling of sending signals to a world that may no longer exist is the solitude of war. An excerpt from a journalist in Osaka, which was quickly censored and erased from public archives, described the scene with unintentional clarity. The planes were few, but they flew like ghosts who came to remind us of something we tried to forget. The roar of their engines was not of enemy victory. It was of our own negligence. We were so busy conquering that we forgot to defend our own roof. The historian reflects, it is in this type of phrase that language becomes a shield and truth a slow poison. The high command could not admit negligence, but the people realized it. Suffering becomes a number, and the number erases a face, but the shock is visceral. The exposed vulnerability was the greatest cost of war for the leadership, forcing it to react rashly and drastically. The war no longer screamed. It whispered in the collective conscience. Finally, the account of a cartographer in Osaka, in a diary he kept secret, carries a note of resignation. My map showed how far we would go, but not what we left behind. The attack made me look at the coastline. That blue barrier, which seemed infinite, was just a point. I looked at my house and saw that it, too, was on the map and therefore within range. The world is not as big as it seemed. It is the last act of resistance, to feel that the battlefront is now your own doorstep. The historian concludes, even in the darkness of censorship and forced triumphalism, humanity creates rituals to remember itself. The cartographer realized that the defensive perimeter was not China, nor the Pacific Islands. It was the minds of the people. When even silence gains sound, we realize that the human is unraveling, but the need for ritual and faith survives. The climax of the mission did not occur in the bombing, but in the sequence of personal catastrophes that followed. Aware that they would not be able to reach Allied airfields, the airmen flew as far as they could toward unoccupied China, where they faced storms and a dark night, without visibility or fuel. The added weight of the improvised fuel tanks made the B-25s almost impossible to fly with precision. The desperate escape over the East China Sea, in atrocious weather, was a true test of physical and psychological endurance. Most of the crew either bailed out or crash-landed in the choppy sea or in Chinese rice paddies. The rain and fog, which had protected the attack from Japanese interception, now complicated survival. Of the 80 men who began the mission, 77 survived the flight and subsequent accidents, most being rescued by Chinese military and local peasants. 3 crew members died in the jump or at sea. 80 men who had accomplished the seemingly impossible now depended on the courage of strangers for survival. The flight plan was a failure, but the spirit of the mission was a resounding success, paid for the risk of life. 8 of the airmen were captured by Japanese forces on Chinese soil. The fate of these men is one of the darkest chapters of the mission, a reminder that the price of audacity is often the brutality of retaliation. Subjected to a summary and infamous trial, 3 were executed by firing squad, and a 4th died in captivity due to illness and malnutrition. The news that pilots had been condemned to death for war crimes only served to intensify American resolve and to expose the cruelty of a humiliated regime. The Japanese strategic response, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was that of a giant wounded in his pride. Yamamoto, already convinced of the need for a decisive battle to annihilate the remaining American fleet, saw the Doolittle raid as proof that it was urgent to push the defensive perimeter eastward, beyond any possibility of further attacks. The target, the small atoll of Midway. The reasoning was simple. If Midway was taken, American forces would not be able to approach close enough to launch another attack on Japan. The Doolittle raid thus became the unwitting catalyst of the Battle of Midway, the true turning point of the war in the Pacific. The psychological success of the American attack led the Japanese command to a monumental miscalculation. Instead of consolidating their gains, they launched into a bold and dispersed operation, driven more by the trauma of humiliation than by cold strategy, committing themselves to an effort that divided their forces and underestimated the enemy's capacity to respond. The attack of 16 bombers triggered one of the greatest naval catastrophes of the empire, proving that haste is strategy's worst counselor. But the tragedy did not stop at military plans. The fury of the Japanese command turned against the Chinese population that had shown solidarity with the downed airmen. In retaliation, the Japanese army launched the Zhujiangjiangxi campaign. The relentless search for prisoners and collaborators transformed southeastern China into a hell of indiscriminate violence. It is estimated that up to 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in an orgy of destruction and terror. Entire villages were burned, supplies stolen, and the population subjected to unspeakable acts of savagery. The Doolittle raid, planned to boost morale, had a devastating and indirect human cost, paid for by the silent loyalty of Chinese peasants. The contrast was striking, a tactically insignificant act, yet with colossal moral and strategic consequences. Japanese leaders, obsessed with saving face and expanding their shield, ignored the fundamental lesson. Vulnerability was a state of mind, not just a geographical point. The curtain of invulnerability had been torn. From that day on, the Japanese people knew, on a deep subconscious level, that the enemy was not just on distant maps. It was potentially lurking just beyond the horizon. The faith in the absolute power of the regime had been replaced by a tense caution, a shadow of fear that would hang over the rest of the conflict. The Doolittle raid was, therefore, less about bombs and more about the perception of power and fragility. It taught that in total war, geographical distance is merely a concept, and the courage of few can alter the moral compass of millions. Japan was not defeated that day, but it received its first warning that the front line of its war had moved irreversibly to its own backyard. The attack was a period mark on imperial arrogance. Colonel Doolittle, who expected a court-martial for losing all his planes, was instead decorated and promoted. The risk was worth it. Morale had been saved. The engines went silent and the wreckage of the B-25s was swept away. But the echo of those morning choices still resonates in humanity's memory. What remains for history is not the list of damages, but the reflection on the moment when unshakable certainty turned into existential doubt. Snow erased the footprint of soldiers and airmen, but not the weight of the decisions made there. The Doolittle raid, more than a reprisal, was proof that the most difficult war is always the one fought within hearts and minds, and victory belongs to those who can break the will of their opponent. The mission's final legacy is complex. For the United States, it was proof that resilience was not an empty word. For Japan, it was a first sign that the war will be neither short nor victorious. And for China, it was a brutal chapter of sacrifice, where the simple humanity of helping a stranger in need was punished with cruelty that defies comprehension. The memory of this attack forces us to confront the central dilemma of all conflict. When strategy meets morality, who pays the highest price? The engines fell silent, but the echo of those night choices still resonates in humanity's memory, reminding us that fear, once planted, is the most persistent of all enemies.